Marvel Rivals. It's the newest hero shooter on the scene to attempt to succeed where Overwatch has failed. But does it really have any magic to it? Or is it just another soulless clone? From my experience with the closed beta, I'm actually quite happy with it. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not entirely qualified to critique this type of game. Not because I've never played hero shooters or competitive online games before, but more because I lack the knowledge of all the intricacies within the genre like a competitive player would. I've put 300 hours into Rainbow Six Siege, and believe it or not, I've actually put 300 hours into Paladins as well. Back when Overwatch was king, my PC wasn't up to running that kind of game, but it could run Paladins. So while everyone else was destroying their opponents as Genji, I was putting in work as Saris. And yet, for all my hours in both of these games, I've never been much for the competitive side of things. I prefer hanging back in the casual matches. So while I might not have perfect ideas for every balance change, movement tweak, or setting, I can share my thoughts on Rivals as a casual player, which I think is a pretty important majority of players when it comes to online games. So join me in yet another multiverse, and let's take a quick look at Marvel Rivals. The first thing that immediately stood out to me when launching the game for the first time was the art style. In a world where AAA games and games based on large IPs constantly go for that total look of realism, I was pleasantly surprised that that was not the case here. This is a game that takes pride in the comic book source material it comes from. And no, it's not like the graphics in-game are a moving comic book, but they do certainly have a bright and colorful color palette that's very reminiscent of the world these characters come from. The UI certainly takes more of a direct comic art inspiration, which is something I heavily respect. While I've seen a lot more online about how Rivals UI looks ripped straight from Overwatch, and yes, the layout is certainly very similar, the art direction still makes it stand out as its own game, and I think that's a point that needs to be made. Skins also show this same respect for the source material. Even the common palette swaps include a brief note of when the costume first appeared in comics or other media, which could even be informative for a collector that learns of a certain costume from the game directly. I was more than hyped to see Venom's Cyan Clash skin, and while most people were excited to see it as a callback to Marvel vs. Capcom, I saw it as more of a reference to the 90s comics like Lethal Protector, when Venom was often portrayed as a much more blue character, a color that I actually think works really well for him. If you didn't get the opportunity to play the beta, you're probably wondering about the gameplay most of all, so I guess I should probably get to that. Thankfully, at least as a casual player, this was not a letdown for me at all. Rivals does the best job it can to make characters really play and feel like your favorite character from the comics, while also fitting in with the hero shooter format. It does mean that power scaling doesn't always make sense. Sure, Magneto would technically kill everyone on the battlefield in an instant with his full power, or even Venom would be a literal god on the battlefield if we're going on the current state of the comics. But that obviously can't happen when we're talking about a multiplayer shooter. But even with the restrictions that must be in place, each character really embodies their comic book counterpart to the best of their abilities. The love for these characters and the lore that surrounds them is really felt within the gameplay, which is something I was not expecting to be saying about a game I honestly expected to be just a soulless Marvel ripoff of a genre that's had some stumbles as of late. And while some people might look at certain characters as straight rips from Overwatch, that doesn't really end up being the case when we get into the nitty-gritty of the gameplay and some of Rival's unique mechanics. Mechanics that change up the core gameplay in ways I've never really seen from other hero shooters. The most intriguing of these mechanics are team-ups. Team-ups, ripped straight from the title of one of the most classic Marvel Comics series, allows players to not just build team compositions based off of roles like tanks, DPS, and healers, but off of bonuses from having certain characters team up on the same team. For example, if Thor and Hela are on the same team, this grants Hela a passive 15% power boost, and allows Thor to be revived if Hela gets a kill in a short window after Thor dies. Or one of my favorites, Bruce Banner infuses Iron Man's armor with gamma energy, which makes his already brutal power-up ability all that more devastating, launching full-on gamma-irradiated blasts at your enemies. Not only is this an incredibly fun system to play around and learn the best team compositions, but it also incentivizes players to learn as many characters in the game as possible. If you're like me, it's all too easy to get locked into playing a single character that you like in these types of games once you find that character that fits your playstyle. Iron Man happens to be that character for me in Rivals. When I put on that suit of armor, it doesn't feel like I'm just playing a game. I am Iron Man. But team-ups lead me to not just play Iron Man, and instead, I actually spent time with every single character in the game. This is something I rarely do when given many different options, but I knew it would serve me and my teams better if I felt comfortable in multiple roles. It also helps that each character is just plain fun. I didn't play a single character I didn't like. Some are more simplistic and some are more complex, but each character has a useful loadout and placement on the team. Nobody feels like filler. It's a strong personal case for why I believe the team-up mechanic is so great. It's a concept and mechanic that really makes Rivals stand out from other hero shooters and multiplayer games I've played in the past. It adds a whole new level to team synergy and highly incentivizes being a well-rounded player that feels comfortable in many roles. It also gives some potentially much-needed benefits and buffs to beginners, allowing them to get into a new character a little quicker when they're receiving some passive buffs from a fellow teammate. Outside of team-ups, the game plays much like a classic hero shooter with a Marbel coat of paint. I'm not saying that's a bad thing either, that's clearly what the game is going for. With games like Overwatch fumbling the bag and no fantastic option to take its place, Rivals feels like it hopes to fill that void, offering a fun, multiplayer experience with a Marvel twist, while still holding true to the simple fun of a hero shooter and not going out of its way to add several layers of new mechanics that muddy the waters. Game modes consist of a fairly regular selection at this point in time. There's the classic Convoy, pushing a payload, Domination, which is essentially a best-of-3 King of the Hill, each round taking place on a new map. And there's Convergence, which is Rivals' main mode when it comes to competitive matches. It works basically just the same as Convoy in quick play, but changes up in competitive matches. Each team takes a turn pushing the payload and defending. 1 point is granted to the attackers for initially capturing the payload, and then additional points are gained from the distance it's pushed. There's a halfway mark checkpoint that counts as a second point, and a total of 3 points is received for pushing the payload the full distance. If both teams get a full 3 points, it comes down to time, otherwise the points decide the victors. It's a fun game mode that lends far better to competitive play than it does casual. At the moment, I don't see the point in keeping it in casual if it acts little different than a typical Convoy match. I'm hoping upon full release they either remove it entirely in quick play, or find a way to make it work as intended. Potentially slightly decreasing the map size or even total points could make the rounds work a little better as a modified version of the game mode for casual matches. I will say one of the biggest downsides to Rivals was the maps. I don't downright hate any of them, and I thought all of them were fine. But that's all I can really say about them. They're fine. Healing packs are found scattered throughout the maps and regenerate on a fairly frequent basis. They're a necessity for high flyers like Iron Man and Storm, characters that won't always get targeted for healing without a lot of communication. Map layouts are fairly basic, with some flanking routes and a main lane for convoy matches, and a large area for domination matches. The settings in Asgard and Tokyo 2099 are both cool, but didn't really grab me as incredible locations. Tokyo 2099 is a pretty basic cyberpunk aesthetic, and Asgard is a fancy city. Aesthetics aren't everything, and it's no massive gripe, but I do wish a little more character from the comics found its way into the maps like it does for the characters. The beta also had a very limited map pool that got repetitive after a near 2-week period, but that shouldn't be a problem in the full release as it should have a larger map pool. Fingers crossed that the full release has many more locations that feel a bit more original to this universe. The environmental destruction was certainly the high point when it comes to Rivals environments. Whole buildings dropping down as players drop gamma bombs on these innocent city streets. The destruction did cause some fairly significant frame drops for me, although I'm running on some pretty outdated hardware at this point. Making these videos and playing newer games like Rivals has pushed me to upgrade my rig very soon, but from what I've heard, these frame issues weren't just on my own. However, for as much as these performance issues are annoying, I can't give Rivals too much shit. It held up my ancient 1660 Ti laptop pretty well. I don't have much else to say about Marbel Rivals. I really only had a few small issues with the game and the current state that it's in, and some tiny gripes with the spray wheel being hidden in each character's cosmetic tab. That was an annoyance to find. But ultimately, I really love this game. It scratches a perfect itch that I didn't even realize I was needing. I hadn't really spent time on a multiplayer game in a while now, with most feeling like I'd have to put in hundreds of hours just to stand a chance against the majority of the player base. Rivals was different. Of course, this game is going to have a high skill ceiling. Of course, there will be sweats, and there will be balance changes and tweaks as the game moves on. Side note, balancing is something I'm not really focused on in this video, as there was nothing so egregiously over or underpowered that it took the fun out of the game for me. I know there will be plenty of changes made, but overall the experience did not feel lacking due to any balancing issues. Yet, all that considered, Rivals really feels like a love letter to both the source material it's based off of, and the genuine fun experience that hero shooters used to represent not even all that long ago. It felt extremely welcoming to a more casual player like myself, and I think a large number of the people that try it will have a blast messing around with their favorite heroes and villains. Of course, when it comes to free-to-play live service games, I'm cautious. But Rivals has my attention, and I'm looking forward to playing more of it. That's it for this one. A bit of a different video than my typical essays, but I wanted to give my 2 cents on this game. Leave a like if you liked, subscribe if you want to see more, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Go poop a snoot.